Iron Ridge, Texas. Summer, 1878. The red dust hadn't even settled when the man looked straight at her eyes, cold as a January sky. City soft hands. His voice held no apology for what it carried. You've never worked a ranch day in your life. She didn't step back. Didn't flinch. Just looked right back at him. I can cook for shelter, mister. O'Leary. One beat of silence. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but enough to tell her she'd just made it through the first door. Follow along. The story starts right now. Stagecoach lurched to a stop, and red dust rolled over everything. It settled on the boardwalk, on the water trough, on the shoulders of the men who stood watching. Iron Ridge, Texas. Population enough to have a saloon and a post office. Not enough to have much else. The sun overhead was a white, merciless thing, burning straight down through a sky with no clouds to interrupt it. Evelyn stepped down from the coach before the driver even finished setting the brake. She wore black, a morning dress that had been elegant once, back when the fabric was new and her life was something she recognized. Now the hem was road gray, and the collar was damp against the back of her neck. She carried 2 carpet bags herself, one in each hand, and set them both down in the dust, without asking anyone for help. Her palms had been blistered since Memphis. She'd stopped noticing them somewhere around Fort Worth. She reached inside her coat and produced a folded scrap of newspaper. She'd cut the advertisement out carefully, the edges straight, and kept it pressed between the pages of her father's Gray's Anatomy for the entire journey west. The paper was soft now from handling, worn at the folds. She smoothed it once against her palm and looked up at the street. A man stood near the hitching post outside the general store, talking to a boy in a wide-brimmed hat. He fit the description well enough. Broad through the shoulder. A jaw that looked like it had been cut from something hard and left out in the weather. A scar ran along the left side of his face, pale and long, old enough to have settled into his skin permanently, like a river that had been there so long the land had just accepted it. Jedediah O'Leary. She walked toward him. Her shoes sank slightly into the packed earth with each step. They were leather-soled, made for cobblestone and parlor floors. They were not made for this. She walked in them anyway. Mr. O'Leary. He turned. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of winter sky just before it commits to either clearing or storming. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that doesn't belong where he found it. She held out the newspaper clipping. He took it, read it, and handed it back without saying a word. I'm answering your advertisement, she said. Cook, housekeeper, general labor, room and board in exchange for work. I can do all of it. He looked at her hands. She did not hide them. She let him look. The blisters, the ink stain on her right index finger, the faint old scar along the base of her thumb she'd gotten years ago in a way she wasn't ready to explain to anyone. Those are city soft hands, he said. His voice was low, unhurried. Not unkind exactly, but without any particular warmth either. You've never worked a ranch day in your life. I've never worked a ranch, she agreed. That's true. The last 3 women who answered that ad were gone inside a week. One left after her first morning. I'm not them. He looked at her face then, really looked. The way people sometimes do when they're deciding whether or not to trust what they're seeing. She met it without flinching. She had stood in worse rooms than this and held steadier. He was about to speak again when the sound of hooves cut through the street. 4 riders came in from the south end of town, and the dust they raised was theatrical, like they'd timed it for effect. The man at the front rode a black horse with expensive tack and wore a cream-colored hat that hadn't been sweated through once. Everything about him was deliberate. His clothes, his posture, the particular way he reined his horse to a stop that said he'd learned long ago that other people would wait for him. Harlan Sterling. Evelyn didn't know the name yet. She learned it from the way Jed's body changed when the riders appeared, shoulders pulling back slightly, jaw tightening. A stillness that wasn't ease but control. Sterling's men spread out loosely behind him. One rested a hand on his holster, without drawing, which was its own kind of statement. O'Leary. Sterling's voice was smooth and large, meant to carry. We need to settle this water boundary business before I lose my patience with the conversation entirely. Your surveyor's wrong, Jed said. I've said it twice. My surveyor is well paid, which makes him very rarely wrong. Sterling smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had charmed enough people over enough years that he'd stopped thinking about what it concealed. His eyes moved to Evelyn. They moved over her slowly. Though I see you've found other things to occupy your attention. He looked at her the way some men do when they've decided a woman exists for their commentary. Unclaimed women on the range, Sterling said pleasantly, to no one and everyone at once. Always a matter of interest, Evelyn turned and looked at him. She did not look away. She did not shift her weight or touch her hair or do any of the small, nervous things that sentence was designed to provoke. She just looked at him with the full, level weight of her attention, the way her mother had once told her a Boston lady never does, and the way her father had quietly taught her she absolutely should. Sterling's smile held, but something behind it flickered. She turned back to Jed. I can cook for shelter, Mr. O'Leary. The words were plain. No performance in them, no pleading, just the offer, laid out clean. Jed looked at her. Then he looked at Sterling, still sitting his black horse with that rehearsed patience. Then he looked back at Evelyn. Something shifted in his expression, small, barely visible, the way a door opens just an inch before a person decides whether to open it the rest of the way. One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, a faint, rare thing that sat between amusement and something more considered. Then stay for supper, ma'am. Sterling's eyes moved between them. Whatever calculation he was making, he kept it behind his face. Think hard about your situation, O'Leary, he said, pulling his horse around. The water rights aren't the only thing I'm patient about. The four riders left the way they came, raising another clean wall of red dust that drifted west and thinned out over the rooftops. The street went back to its ordinary sounds. A dog somewhere, the creak of a sign in the hot wind, the stagecoach driver talking to someone near the water trough. Jed picked up one of Evelyn's carpetbags without asking. He started walking toward the far end of the street, where a wagon and a single brown horse waited. Evelyn picked up the other bag and followed. You know that man, she asked. I know what he wants. Is it the water boundary? Jed didn't answer right away. He lifted her bag into the wagon bed with the ease of a man used to loading things heavier than that, then untied the horse from the post. The water boundary is what he says he wants, he said finally. What he actually wants is the whole valley. Evelyn set her own bag in the wagon and climbed up onto the bench before he could think to offer a hand up. She straightened her skirt, tucked it out of the way of the wheel, and looked out at the road that ran north out of Iron Ridge into scrub brush and the first low rise of hills. And the ranch is in the valley, she said. Ranch is in the valley. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon rolled forward, and the dust of Iron Ridge settled behind them. Evelyn held her carpetbags on her lap for the first mile without speaking. The sun moved slightly west, but gave up none of its heat. The red earth ran out on both sides of the road, dotted with scrub oak and the occasional burst of yellow wildflower that had no business looking so cheerful out here, but bloomed anyway. She looked down at her hands, the blisters, the ink stain, the road dust already filling in the cracks of her knuckles. City-soft hands. She pressed them flat against the worn leather of her bag and let the wagon carry her forward. She had come west to survive. She knew that. But survival, she had learned, was not a passive thing. It didn't find you while you stood still and waited. It asked something of you every single day, and the only question worth answering was whether you were willing to pay. The horse's hooves hit the dry road in a steady rhythm. The hills came closer. Somewhere ahead, past the scrub and the dust, and the long blue shadow of the ridge, a ranch was struggling to hold itself together against a man who wanted it gone. She had nowhere else to go. That wasn't the same thing as weakness. The wagon rolled on, and Iron Ridge disappeared behind the first curve in the road, and Evelyn Mercer, who had once been Evelyn Vance, who had once had a daughter and a husband and a house with real glass windows, pressed her shoulders back and watched the horizon come to meet her. The kitchen was not what she'd imagined. She hadn't imagined much, honestly. She'd told herself not to, somewhere around the third day on the stagecoach, when the landscape outside the window stopped being recognizable and started being something altogether foreign. Expectations were a kind of luggage she couldn't afford. But still, the kitchen. It was a long, low-ceilinged room at the back of the ranch house, and it smelled of old grease and wood ash, and something vaguely animal that she chose not to investigate immediately. A single window above the wash basin faced east, which would be good in the mornings and useless the rest of the day. A rough-hewn table ran down the center, scarred with years of use, knives and tin plates, and the general violence of feeding working men 3 times a day. Shelves along the far wall held flour sacks, dried beans, a collection of mismatched tins, and 2 cast-iron skillets hanging from hooks that had been bent at slightly different angles, as if installed on separate occasions by separate people, neither of whom had a level. And the stove. It dominated the north wall, the way a difficult person dominates a room, by sheer physical presence, by the undeniable fact of itself, by the way everything else in the space seemed to have organized around accommodating it. Black iron, heavy-bellied, with a firebox door that hung slightly crooked on its hinge, and a flue pipe that ran up through the ceiling at an angle that suggested improvisation rather than design. Evelyn set her carpetbags down in the corner of the kitchen and stood in front of it. She had cooked on iron stoves before. The kitchen in her father's house in Boston had one, smaller and better tempered, and the cook, Mrs. Hobart, who had suffered Evelyn's youthful curiosity with remarkable grace, had taught her that every stove had its own particular character, its own preferences about airflow and fuel, and the exact position of the damper that made the difference between a steady burn and a temperamental disaster. She opened the firebox door and looked inside. Cold ash, a few unburned knots of wood from whoever had last used it, and a smell of old smoke that came out at her in a wave. She found the kindling box near the back door. She found the matches on the shelf above it. She found, after a search through 3 of the mismatched tins, a small amount of dried tinder. She built the fire the way her father had taught her, which was the way field surgeons built campfires, small and deliberate at the center. Larger fuel added only once the foundation was solid. The first batch of biscuits burned, not slightly, thoroughly. She smelled them before she could stop it, pulled the pan from the oven to find them blackened on the bottom and raw at the center, which was almost an impressive failure, the kind that required specific conditions to achieve. The flue wasn't drawing right. The oven ran hot on the left side and cold on the right, which she hadn't known yet because she hadn't had time to learn it yet. She stood over the ruined pan for a moment. Then she scraped the biscuits into the waste bin, washed the pan, and started again. The second attempt came out better still, not right. The bottoms too dark and the tops too pale, but edible, which was what mattered this first morning. She made a note in her head about the left side of the oven. She turned the pan halfway through the bake on her third attempt, which she made that same afternoon, after the ash and smoke had filled the room thoroughly enough that her eyes were watering. By the time she'd worked out the stove's particular temperament, 2 hours of persistent ash-covered, smoke-stung trial, her palms were bleeding, where a fresh blister had torn open against the handle of the kindling axe. She'd gone out back and chopped her own wood when the kindling box ran low because there was no one else in the kitchen to do it, and the stove needed feeding regardless of what her hands thought about it. She wrapped her left palm with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of her second-best petticoat, the one she'd already decided was going to be sacrificed to practical purposes, and she went back to the stove. She had dried beans soaking by noon. By mid-afternoon, she had cornbread in the oven turned once, watched carefully, pulled at exactly the right moment, and a pot of beans with salt pork working on the back burner. She'd found an onion in the cool cellar below the kitchen floor and added it in. She found dried chilies hanging from a nail near the back door, 3 of them, and crumbled 2 into the pot. It wasn't Boston cooking. It wasn't trying to be. The men came in at sunset. There were 5 of them, besides Jed Cowboys, in various stages of end-of-day exhaustion, hats in hand, boots loud on the plank floor, speaking to each other in the abbreviated way men speak when they've been working alongside each other long enough that full sentences feel unnecessary. They settled around the long table with the ease of habit, moving around each other, reaching past each other for the tin cups stacked near the door. They looked at her with the particular wariness of people who had been disappointed before. She could feel it, the assessing quiet when she set the cornbread on the table. The way one of them, a young man, with a sun-reddened face and pale eyes, leaned over and said something low to the man beside him. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either, more like a collective holding of breath, waiting to see how long she'd last. She'd heard two of them betting in the yard before supper. 3 days, one said. The other said she wouldn't make it past the end of the week. She put the beans in the center of the table, ladled them herself, and sat down at the end to eat. It was then that she noticed. The back door was open to the evening air, and on the porch step outside it, a man sat alone with his plate balanced on his knee. He was young, maybe 22, with a build that said he did real work and a quiet self-containment about him that had nothing to do with shyness. He was eating his supper in the fading light, watching the last colors leave the sky to the west, with the precise stillness of someone who has made peace with his own company because he's had no choice about it. Nico. She'd been introduced to him briefly when the wagon came in. He'd nodded to her politely and gone back to his work without ceremony. She'd noticed his hands, then capable, sure, the hands of someone who knew exactly what he was doing with horses. She looked at the empty space at the table. She looked at the back door. She looked at Jed. He was already watching her. He'd seen what she was seeing. He picked up his tin mug and set it back down on the table with a sound that was not quite a slam, but close enough. It brought the low hum of conversation to a stop. Every face at the table turned toward him. Jed didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, it was with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided what he believes and stopped being interested in arguing about it. At the Broken Anchor, we ride the same trail, break the same bread, and bleed the same red blood. I don't measure a man by his skin or his lineage. I measure him by his sweat and his honor. Anyone who thinks he's too good to eat at the same table as Nico can take his plate out to the dirt. No one moved. No one spoke. The fire in the stove ticked softly in the silence. Jed looked at the back door. Nico, he said, get in here and eat at the table. There was a pause from the porch, then the sound of boots on wood, and Nico appeared in the doorway with his plate, reading the room in one practiced sweep the way a man does who has learned to read rooms quickly because rooms have not always been safe for him. He found an empty space at the bench, sat down, and resumed eating without comment. The man with the sun-reddened face looked at his beans. He picked up his spoon. He ate. That was that. Evelyn refilled the cornbread plate. From the extra she'd made extra on purpose, not knowing how much these men ate, and she'd been right to and passed it down the table. The conversation resumed gradually. Quiet at first, then more ordinary. After supper, she cleaned the kitchen alone. The men filtered out to the bunkhouse or the porch, and she washed the pots and the plates in water she'd heated on the stove and stacked them on the shelf. The window above the basin was dark. By then the night outside, full of insect sound and the distant lowing of cattle. Her hands hurt, both of them, the torn blister on her left and the stiffness in her right from the kindling axe. She dried them carefully on the kitchen cloth and looked at the stove. She had learned 3 things about it today. She would learn 3 more tomorrow. That was how anything difficult worked. You didn't conquer it all at once. You learned it in pieces, stubbornly, until the pieces added up to something you could use. She banked the stove for the night, the way Mrs. Hobart had taught her enough coal to keep the heat without burning through the fuel. And she carried her carpet bags to the small room off the kitchen that Jed had told her was hers. It had a cot, a hook on the wall, and a window no bigger than a piece of paper. It was the smallest room she had ever slept in. She sat on the cot, and it creaked under her, and she put her face in her damaged hands for just a moment, not crying, just resting, just letting herself feel the full weight of the day without having to carry it upright. Then she lay down in her clothes, because she was too tired to manage the buttons on her dress, and she was asleep before she finished the thought she'd started. Outside, the Texas night went on without her, wide and dark, and full of stars that had no interest in human difficulty, burning the same as they always had, the same as they always would. She was still there in the morning. That was what mattered. She was still there. 3 days passed. Then 4, she learned the stove. She learned the handle stuck on the upstroke, and you had to lift it slightly before you pulled, or it locked up entirely. She learned that the flour sacks needed to be kept elevated off the floor, or the moisture crept in from the ground and ruined the bottom third. She learned that the cowboys preferred their coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and did not consider it a preference so much as a baseline requirement for human functioning. She learned their names. The sun-reddened one was called Cutter, though she suspected that wasn't the name his mother had given him. The one who ate the most and talked the least was called Briggs. There were 2 brothers, Pete and Danny, who communicated with each other in half-sentences and had been doing ranch work since they were 12 years old. Tomas older than the rest, maybe 60, with a face that had been worked over by decades of weather into something that looked less like skin and more like carved wood. He moved through the ranch with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with volume or assertion. Horses settled when he came near them, the way water settles when something stops disturbing it. He was the one, on the 5th morning, who nodded at her over his coffee and said, "Good beans yesterday, Senora." It was 2 words more than he'd offered her the entire week prior. She took it for what it was, which was, from Tomas, approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. She made extra beans that day. The end of the first week came and went, and she was still there. And on the 8th morning she noticed that Cutter had stopped leaning over to talk low to the man beside him when she entered the room. He just reached for his coffee instead. Small things. But she was a woman who had learned to read small things. On the 9th day, she started on the bread. Real bread, yeast bread, not cornbread, which required managing a starter and a rising time, and the temperamental cooperation of the oven. She had now studied enough to mostly trust. She'd found a crock in the cellar that would do, and she'd started the starter 3 days prior, with flour and water and patience, feeding it each morning, watching it come alive with the slow reliability of something that only works if you don't try to rush it. The bread came out right, dense and brown-crusted, with a crumb that held up to being torn by work-round hands. She set 2 loaves on the table for supper and watched, without appearing to watch, as Briggs, who had never once commented on anything she'd cooked, cut himself a second piece and held it for a moment before eating it, with the expression of a man who is slightly surprised to find himself pleased. She turned back to the stove and allowed herself one small private smile against the heat of the firebox. The smoke had long since stopped making her eyes water. She was learning this place, and slowly, in the way that places do when you stop being foreign to them, it was beginning to learn her back. The range was nothing like the kitchen. Out there, it was open in a way that could make you feel very small or very free, depending on what you brought to it. The sky went on without apparent limit in every direction, and the grass ran from the ranch buildings to the low hills in the west in a long sweep of dry gold and pale green. In the morning, the light came sideways and lit everything from the east, making ordinary things, fence posts, cattle, a man on horseback crossing the ridge, look briefly significant, the way paintings in a museum made ordinary subjects look significant just by the fact of being painted at all. Evelyn had started going out in the mornings after the breakfast things were washed. Not far, just to the near pasture, or along the fence line where the kitchen garden would eventually be, if she had anything to say about it. She had already found a corner near the south wall of the house that got good sun and some protection from the worst of the wind, and she had started turning the soil there with a broken-handled spade she'd found in the lean-to. Her hands had stopped complaining about work somewhere around the end of the first week. They had accepted the new arrangement. She was out along the east fence line on a Thursday morning, maybe an hour after breakfast, when she heard it. A shout, sharp and short. Then a horse's screaming, that particular high panicked sound that horses make and that cuts through every other noise on a ranch and makes everyone's head come up. She was already moving before she'd consciously decided to. She came around the near side of the corral at a run and saw it. Nico's horse, a young bay, gelding that had been recently acquired and was still working out its relationship with its rider, had come down hard. It had stumbled in a depression hidden in the grass, gone over sideways, and Nico had come off and hit the ground with his right shoulder first, his arm out to break the fall. He was up. That was the first thing she checked. He was on his feet, which meant no head injury, no broken leg. But he was holding his right arm cradled against his chest, and his face was set in the particular, tight, controlled expression of a man managing serious pain by refusing to acknowledge it. 3 of the cowboys had reached him before she did. Cutter had his hands already on Nico's shoulder, and he was talking to him with the cheerful, blunt-edged practicality of a man who has seen dislocations before and has some thoughts about how to fix them. "We'll just pull her straight and quick," Cutter was saying. "Briggs, grab his arm up at the elbow. You ready? On 3, we just..." "Stop." Evelyn's voice came out steadier than she felt. They all turned to look at her. She had seen this done wrong before. Her father had shown her what it looked like. When a dislocated shoulder was reduced by brute force, the tearing, the nerve damage, the months of limited motion afterward, the cases that never fully healed. Pulling straight was the instinctive approach. It was also the one most likely to make things significantly worse. "Don't pull it," she said, coming closer. "You'll tear the tissue." Cutter looked at her with an expression that was not quite dismissive, but was close. "Ma'am, I've seen this done a dozen." "So have I," she said, "and I've seen what it looks like when it's done wrong." She looked at Nico directly. He was watching her with pain-sharpened eyes that were nevertheless calm, which she appreciated. Panic made this harder. "Can you let me look at it?" she asked him. Not an order, a question which mattered. He nodded once. She moved to his right side and ran her hands over the joint carefully, not roughly, not quickly. She pressed with her fingertips to locate the head of the humerus, to understand exactly what had happened and where. Anterior dislocation, she was nearly certain. The shoulder was visibly deformed, the normal round contour of the deltoid flattened. The arm held slightly away from his body, the way dislocated shoulders always were, because any other position was intolerable. She looked around, found what she needed, a flat rock, low and wide near the fence post. "Sit here," she told him, guiding him to the rock. "Lean forward slightly. Let your arm hang." "What are you?" Cutter started. "Gravity," she said, not unkindly. "The muscle is in spasm. It's holding the joint out of place. If we let the weight of his arm pull downward slowly, the spasm releases on its own." She knelt beside him, keeping one hand very lightly on the back of his arm, not to pull, just to monitor. She could feel the tension in the muscle, that locked-down resistance of tissue that has been traumatized and is protecting itself by gripping tighter. "Look at the hills," she told him. "Not at your arm." He looked at the hills. She waited. 30 seconds. A minute. The cowboys around them were quiet now, watching. She felt it. Before she heard it, the faint, unmistakable shift of the muscle releasing, the slow crawl of the joint moving back toward where it belonged. She applied the lightest possible lateral pressure, following the path the anatomy itself wanted to take. Not forcing, guiding. The shoulder reduced. Nico exhaled through his teeth, sharp, involuntary, and then blinked. He moved his arm slightly, testing, and his eyes changed. The tight pain control in his face eased into something closer to surprise. "That's it," she said, sitting back. "It's back. Don't lift anything with that arm today. Tomorrow, gentle movement only. The muscle will be sore for a few days. If you feel tingling in your fingers or lose grip strength, tell me immediately." She stood, brushing the dust from her knees. The silence around the corral had a different quality than the silence before. Cutter was looking at her with his mouth closed for once. Briggs, behind him, had his arms crossed and was staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man rearranging information. Nico looked up at her. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quiet and direct, without performance in it. She nodded once and turned back toward the house. Jed was standing at the edge of the corral fence. She hadn't seen him approach. He was good at that, arriving at the edge of things without making an entrance of it. He'd been watching, she understood. He'd watched the whole thing. His gray eyes were on her with an attention that was different from his usual assessment. More still, like something that had been moving had come to rest. She met his look. He didn't say anything right then. He just stepped aside from the fence to let her pass, and she walked back toward the kitchen. She heard him tell the men behind her to get back to work, heard the ordinary sounds of the ranch, reassembling itself, horses' voices, the distant rhythm of fence work. She spent the afternoon making supper and not thinking about Jed O'Leary's gray eyes. She was mostly successful. That night, the ranch was quieter than usual. A cold front was pushing down from the north, the kind you could smell, before you could feel something metallic and open in the air that came in through the kitchen window and made the lamp flame lean sideways. She'd built the fire up in the stove, and the kitchen was warm, and she sat in the chair near the hearth, with her father's copy of Gray's Anatomy open in her lap, not reading exactly, just resting her eyes on the familiar diagrams. The back door opened. Jed came in from the yard, hat off, carrying it in one hand. He looked at the stove first, the way men who have worked cold days always look at a fire with uncomplicated gratitude for the fact of it. Then he looked at her. "You mind company?" he said. "No," she said. He pulled the other chair to the hearth and sat in it. He stretched his legs toward the stove and was quiet for a moment, which she'd come to understand was not discomfort on his part, but simply the way he moved into a room, gradually settling himself before he said anything. She closed the anatomy book, kept it in her lap. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. The shoulder. She'd been expecting the question since noon. She'd been deciding since noon how to answer it. "My father," she said. "He was an army surgeon. I spent more time in his study than most people thought was appropriate for a girl." She paused. "He thought it was appropriate. That was enough for me." Jed looked at the fire. "He teach you much?" "Everything he could," she said. "Everything I could absorb," which was a fair amount. She waited to see what he did with that. Men responded differently to that information. Some found it interesting. Some found it threatening. Some found it sad, the way people sometimes found capable women sad, as if ability in the wrong container was its own kind of tragedy. Jed just nodded slowly. "Good thing," he said. "For Nico." She looked at the fire, too. The wood she'd used tonight was better. She'd learned which pieces from the pile burned steadier. If Cutter had pulled that arm, she said, Nico could have lost function in that hand. Permanently, maybe. The axillary nerve runs right through that region. One wrong movement, and she stopped herself, aware she was going into clinical detail that hadn't been asked for. But Jed wasn't looking at her with the polite vacancy of someone waiting for medical information to be over. He was listening. "I didn't know that," he said simply. "Most people don't. The instinct is always to pull. It looks right, it's just not right." He was quiet again. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it working along the edge of the roof, looking for gaps. "I was at Gettysburg," he said. It came out of him without preamble, the way things sometimes do when a person has decided to say something before they can stop themselves. He looked at the fire when he said it. She didn't speak. She understood that this was not an opening to a conversation, but a door being held open, and that what he needed right now was not questions, but space. "Second day," the wheat field. His jaw moved slightly, not speaking, just processing something. "The artillery went on, for you lose. Count. After a while it wasn't sound anymore, it was something your body just absorbed. Like weather. Like it was just a condition of existing." The scar along his jaw caught the firelight. He didn't touch it. He probably hadn't touched it consciously in years. "I still hear it," he said, "sometimes. When it's quiet enough, which isn't often out here, which is part of why I came out here, I suppose." Evelyn turned her wedding ring, which she still wore out of habit more than sentiment. The gold was thin, and she turned it around her finger, the way she had through long nights of the kind she did not discuss with anyone. "I had a daughter," she said. He looked at her. "Clara." The name still cost something to say out loud. It would probably always cost something. "She was 4, she breathed. There was a fire in the house. My husband, he'd been there, were debts, and he was not himself, not for a long time before the end. And the fire," she stopped, started again more simply. "I couldn't get to her in time. The kitchen was very quiet. I replay it," she said. "What I would do differently." if I had been on that floor. Instead of she closed her hands on the book in her lap. I know, medically, that there are moments where outcome is determined before action is possible. I know that. I still replay it. Jed looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say it wasn't her fault. He didn't say she should forgive herself, or that Clara was in a better place, or any of the other things people had said to her in Boston drawing rooms with the best and most useless intentions. I'm sorry. 2 words. Fully meant. She looked at him, at the scar in the gray eyes, and the set of his shoulders that even at rest carried the shape of something heavy. So am I, she said. For Gettysburg, he nodded. He turned back to the fire. They sat there together in the warm kitchen, while the cold front moved in outside, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the particular quiet of 2 people who have each been very alone for a very long time, and have found, without looking for it, someone else in the room who understands what that costs. The fire burned down slowly. She added wood twice. He stayed until the wind outside had settled into its full night rhythm, then stood, put his hat on, and went back out to check the livestock the way he did every night before bed. The last circuit of a man who has learned that the only way to keep things from falling apart is to keep watching them. The door closed behind him. Evelyn sat in the warm kitchen for another few minutes, her father's book in her lap, listening to the wind move over the roof of this small, difficult, slowly becoming familiar place. Clara, she thought, and then she thought, I'm still here. Both things were true. Both things, she was learning, could be true at the same time. She banked the stove for the night and went to bed. The town of Caldwell Crossing held its autumn social on the last Saturday of October, and the whole valley knew about it 2 weeks in advance. Word traveled, the way word traveled out here, through the men who rode into town for supplies, through the women who sent letters, through the particular energy that moved through a community that spent most of its time working too hard to gather and was genuinely glad for an excuse. By the time the date arrived, even Tomas, who expressed enthusiasm for approximately nothing, had oiled his good boots. Evelyn heard about it from Briggs, which told her something about the event's significance. Briggs communicated in grunts and the occasional short declarative sentence. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, set his empty coffee cup on the counter, and said, "Social Saturday. Town hall, you going?" "I hadn't thought about it," she said. "Thinking about it's advisable," he said, and walked out. She thought about it. She found the dress in the bottom of her second carpet bag, where she'd packed it with the optimism of a woman who hadn't yet fully understood what she was traveling toward. Dark blue wool, fitted through the bodice with a small lace collar that she had made herself one winter evening in Boston, when she still had winters with evenings in them. It was too fine for ranch work and not fine enough for a Boston dinner party, which had always left it without a clear occasion. Out here, she suspected. It was the finest thing she owned that also remained intact. She spread it across her cot on Thursday evening and looked at it. The waist seam on the right side had pulled. The hem had caught on something during the journey and torn an inch at the back. She found her sewing basket, which was also, quietly, her medical supply basket, the 2 purposes coexisting without conflict, and spent an hour repairing it. She took in the waist seam slightly while she was at it. She had lost weight since Boston. Not dramatically, but undeniably. Ranch work did that. Saturday came dry and cold, with a sky so blue it looked painted. They rode in 2 wagons, Jed, with Evelyn, on the bench of the first, the rest of the hands in the second. Nico had his arm in a sling that Evelyn had fashioned from flour sack linen, and he rode beside Tomas on the wagon bench with the careful posture of a man who had been firmly instructed not to jostle anything. She'd told him 3 days prior when she changed the compress on his shoulder. "You're healing cleanly," she said. "The joint is seating well. But the muscle needs time, and time is the one thing you can't accelerate. Rest it fully this week. Go to the social, dance with nobody, and come home having done nothing dramatic." He had looked at her with that steady, watchful expression of his. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she believed him, because Nico was one of those people who actually meant what he said. Jed, beside her on the wagon bench, wore a dark vest she hadn't seen before. It was well cut, finer than his work clothes, and something about it shifted him slightly, still plainly a working man, but one who had, at some earlier point in his life, inhabited rooms where clothing was attended to. The scar along his jaw was the same. The gray eyes were the same. But in the dark vest with his good hat, he looked like a man who contained more history than he regularly chose to discuss. She'd thought that before. She was thinking it again now, sitting close enough on the bench that the cold air pressed them both inward toward each other. "You're quiet," he said, after they'd been on the road 20 minutes. "I'm often quiet," she said, "more than usual." She looked at the road ahead. The afternoon light was coming in low from the west, golden slanted, making the scrub grass glow at the tips. "I haven't been to a social in a long time," she said. I'd forgotten what to do with the anticipation of one. He didn't say anything to her that, but she heard him make a small sound that might, on another man's face, have been a smile. The town hall in Caldwell Crossing was a long, high-ceilinged building that on ordinary occasions hosted town meetings and the occasional church service when the weather made the actual church inaccessible. Tonight, it had been transformed by the collective effort of 24 women who understood that transformation was possible if you applied enough lantern light and enough determination. Hurricane lanterns hung from the rafters by wire, dozens of them, swaying very slightly in the air, moved by the open doors, casting everything in warm amber. Someone had strung dried autumn leaves along the walls, and the smell in the room was beeswax and pine resin, and the particular warm human crowd smell of people who had dressed in their best and come to have a good time. A fiddle started up near the far wall, then a second fiddle, then a man with a squeeze box joined them, and the music filled the high ceiling and came back down, changed, richer, and the first couples were already moving to the floor. Evelyn stood near the door and took it in. She had not, she realized, stood in a room full of people being happy in quite some time. It required a moment of adjustment, like stepping from a dark space into sunlight and waiting for your eyes to tell you what you were actually seeing. Jed had gone to speak to someone near the far wall, a rancher she didn't know, older, with a white beard, and the look of a man who had strong opinions about water rights. She watched the room, watched the children chasing each other between adult legs, watched the older women at the tables along the side wall, presiding over pies and cakes with the authority of people who know their contribution is central to the enterprise, even if no one says so. She watched Nico and Tomas approach the main entrance, and she watched the two men step in front of them. Sterling's men, she recognized them from Iron Ridge, the one who'd rested his hand on his holster, and the broader one who stood just behind him. They weren't drunk. That would have been simpler. They were sober and deliberate, blocking the doorway with the cheerful malice of people who have decided that casual cruelty is a form of entertainment. "Not sure this is your kind of gathering," the first one said to Nico. He said it pleasantly, almost conversationally, which was its own kind of ugliness. Tomas had gone very still beside Nico. It was not the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of a man with a great deal of experience, deciding how to respond to ignorance, and the calculus being very, very quick. Nico's face was composed. He said nothing. He had learned, in 22 years of life, in a country that was frequently hostile to his existence, when to speak and when to conserve himself. His eyes were level and calm. Evelyn was already moving. She crossed the room at a pace that did not look rushed, because a woman crossing a room quickly drew attention in ways that were not always useful. She arrived at the doorway with the social ease of someone who simply wanted to greet her friends and found herself standing, quite naturally, between Sterling's men and the two wranglers. She turned to the first man with the bright, unhurried smile of a Boston society woman who has attended 500 events exactly like this and is completely in her element. "I don't believe I caught your name," she said, "though I do recall your horse. Lovely animal. I noticed it in Iron Ridge. Is it yours? Or do you ride Mr. Sterling's stock generally?" The man blinked. He hadn't expected the question. People who ask confident, specific questions have a way of disrupting the rhythm of people who are used to others stepping back. "What?" he said. "Only asking," she said pleasantly. because I was speaking with Deputy Marsh. Earlier this evening, lovely man, his wife makes an extraordinary apple cake. She's here tonight, I believe. And he mentioned there's been some question about the provenance of certain horses in the county. She tilted her head slightly. I'm sure it's nothing. Still, I always think it's wise to know exactly what one owns and what one is merely borrowing, don't you? There was no deputy named Marsh. There was no conversation earlier that evening. She had been in a wagon on the road an hour ago. But the man didn't know that. He looked at his companion. His companion looked at the room at the occupied, sociable room full of neighbors, and a small but present contingent of men who wore badges, and made the small recalculation that men in his position make when the audience is wrong for what they were about to do. We were just leaving, the second one said. Wonderful, Evelyn said, still smiling. Enjoy the evening. They went. She turned to Nico and Tomas. Tomas was looking at her with something in his face that was close to what she imagined satisfaction. Looked like on a man who expressed almost nothing. Nico met her eyes and gave her one small, deliberate nod. Shall we go in? She said. They went in. She found the table with the cider and poured herself a cup, and her hands were completely steady, and she was quite proud of that. A hand appeared beside hers and poured a second cup. She looked up. Jed. He had seen it. Some part of the conversation, at least enough. His gray eyes held something she hadn't seen in them at quite this intensity before. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The way you look at something when it confirms what you had begun to suspect. Razor sharp, he said quietly. I simply asked a question, she said. You asked 4 questions and implied a 5th, and none of them were real. All of them were real, she said. I simply arranged the implications. Something moved across his face. He picked up his cider cup. I should have seen that coming, he said. I should have been there. You were speaking with someone across the room, she said, and I was closer. He looked at her for a moment. You're not what I thought you were, he said, when you got off that coach. I know, she said. You thought I was city soft. I thought you were running from something. She held his gaze. I was, she said. That doesn't determine what someone runs toward. The fiddles on the far side of the room moved into something slower. The couples on the floor adjusted, drawing closer. The quick-step energy becoming something more measured and more deliberate. Jed set down his cup. He looked at her, not with the assessment she had grown accustomed to reading in his face. The constant calibration of a man who trusted slowly. This was different. This was a man who had finished calculating and arrived somewhere. Dance with me, he said. It was not a command, and not exactly a question. Something in between, offered simply, without ornament. She set down her cup. All right, she said. He put one hand at her waist, and she felt the weight of it through the blue wool, a calloused, scarred hand, a hand that had held a rifle and a branding iron and a fence post and the reins of a horse for 20 years of hard living, resting with extraordinary care at the curve of her waist, as if it understood the difference between things you grip and things you simply hold. She put her hand in his other hand. His fingers closed around hers. They moved into the music. She had danced in Boston. She had danced in ballrooms with parquet floors and string quartets, and the elaborate social choreography of people performing their status at each other. She had been good at it, technically, the same way she had been technically good at all the things Boston expected of her. This was different. The fiddle music was imperfect and human, and alive in the way a string quartet was not, and the floor was planked wood, with a nailhead, here and there, that caught your heel if you weren't watching, and the light from the hurricane lanterns moved when the air moved, and none of it was elegant in the formal sense, but something about it was more honest than anything she'd danced to in 10 years of Boston winters. Jed moved well, not with the trained precision of a dancing school education, but with the same physical surety he brought to everything else, a man who understood where his body was in space and what to do with it, and who, right now, was entirely attentive to where she was in space as well. She looked up at him. He was looking at her already. The room went on around them. The fiddles, the children, the older couples, the particular warm amber of all those lanterns, and she was aware of it all and also not particularly interested in any of it. She was interested in the hand at her waist, and the gray eyes above the old scar, and the entirely unexpected fact that she was here at all, in this body, in this room, in this life she had not planned. His hold on her waist shifted, very slightly, as the music slowed further. Closer. She did not step back. "Your hands aren't city soft anymore," he said. His voice was low, meant only for her. "No," she agreed. "I was wrong about that. The first day. You were working with limited information. I should have looked closer." She held his gaze. "You're looking now," she said. The music moved through them both, and his eyes didn't leave hers, and the lanterns overhead swayed in the warm air, and outside the Texas night was cold and vast and full of the things that would need attending to tomorrow. The water dispute and the hay stores and the fence line that needed repair before the first hard freeze. All of that was true, and this was also true, right now, and she let herself have it without apology. The fiddles played on. Neither of them looked away. The ride home was quiet in the best sense of the word. The stars were extraordinary. The sky out here was simply a different sky than the one over Boston, bigger and darker and more serious about itself. And the wagon moved through the cold night with just the sound of the horse and the creak of the wheels and Jed's steady breath beside her. She pulled her coat closer. Without comment, he shifted on the bench, and she felt the warmth of his arm against hers, and neither of them addressed it, and neither of them moved away. Behind them, in the second wagon, she could hear Pete and Danny arguing quietly about something inconsequential, and Tomas's occasional low word that ended the argument, and once, Nico's brief laugh, surprising and real and good to hear in the dark. The broken anchor's lights appeared at the end of the road. Someone had left the kitchen lamp burning. She'd probably left it herself before they departed, out of the habit of a woman who had learned not to come home to darkness. Jed pulled the wagon to a stop at the house. She climbed down before he could assist, because she had been climbing down from things herself for months now, and saw no reason to stop. He came around the horse's head and stood near enough that she could see his face in the lamplight, coming through the kitchen window. "Good evening," she said. It was a formal thing to say, and slightly absurd given everything, and she saw him register that. "Good evening," he said, with the same formality, and that small, rare expression moved across his face again, the one that lived between amusement and something more. She went inside. She stood in the warm kitchen for a moment, with her coat still on, and the lamp burning, and the stove cool, now but easy enough to build back up in the morning. She pressed her right hand flat against the center of her chest, not dramatically, just checking, the way you check a thing to confirm it's real. Her heart was beating with more enthusiasm than strictly necessary. She took her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door. Tomorrow there was bread to make, and a fence to think about, and a winter coming down from the north with its own intentions. Tomorrow was full of the ordinary demands of a life being rebuilt, piece by piece, from materials she was still learning to use. Tonight there had been lanterns and fiddles and a hand at her waist. Both things were true. Both things were hers. She turned down the lamp and went to bed. November came in like a warning. The first week brought frosts that killed the last of the kitchen garden and turned the water in the troughs to a skim of ice each morning that had to be broken before the horses drank. The second week brought a cold so persistent that the ground itself changed, hardening, tightening, losing the last of its give underfoot. The men worked in layers now, and their breath showed white in the air from the moment they stepped outside until they came back in for supper. Evelyn had put up preserves in October. Her kitchen garden had produced more than she'd expected from the corner plot near the south wall, and she had spent 3 evenings in a row at the stove, boiling jars and sealing them, the kitchen hot and steam-filled in a way that felt wealthy compared to the cold outside. The shelves in the cellar held 24 jars of tomatoes, 8 of beans, 6 of apple butter she'd made from the small gnarly apples on the tree at the property's edge that no one had thought to harvest in years. She had thought to harvest them. That was the kind of woman she was. The third week of November, the sky changed. She noticed it before anyone said anything. She was at the kitchen window, washing the breakfast things when she saw the color go out of the western sky, not evening darkness, which came from the east, but a different dimming, a flat gray pressing down from the north that had weight to it. She'd grown up in Boston, where nor'easters announced themselves with the same heavy sky, and her body recognized it before her mind had finished the sentence. She went to the back door and opened it. The temperature hit her like something physical. The wind was out of the north, and it had shifted in the last hour. She could tell by the way the barn's weather vane was sitting, and by the sound the wind made along the eave, a lower pitch than the morning's wind, deeper-bellied, carrying more mass behind it. This was not a frost. This was a blizzard coming in. She went to find Jed. He was already at the corral gate, looking north, which told her that he'd felt it too. Nico was beside him. They were speaking low, looking at the same sky she'd just been looking at. "How long do we have?" she asked, coming up beside them. Jed looked at the clouds. 4 hours, he said. "Maybe 5. It'll hit tonight." "The hay barn," Nico said. "The south wall's been patching since September. If the wind goes sideways, I know," Jed said. "Get Pete and Danny on the livestock. Get everything into the main barn before dark." They moved fast for the rest of the afternoon. She didn't go back to the kitchen. She went to the barn and helped Tomas with the horses, leading them in from the pasture 2 at a time, checking water levels, throwing extra hay into each stall. Tomas worked beside her without comment, which she had learned was his highest form of acceptance. He talked to the horses in Spanish as he led them, low and steady, and they came with him willingly. By the time the light failed, every animal was in, and the barn doors were secured, and the wind was doing something it hadn't done before, driving snow horizontally, not downward, so that, when you looked into it, there was nothing to see but white. Temperature had dropped 20 degrees since noon. Evelyn's face was numb from the cheekbones out by the time she got back to the kitchen. She built the stove up high and started a pot of coffee and stood at the window and watched the storm erase the ranch. That was when she saw the glow. It was wrong color, wrong direction. It was coming from the south side of the property, where the hay barn sat, and it was orange, in a way that firelight is orange, not steady, but alive and climbing. She was out the back door before she had a coherent thought. The cold hit her without her coat, but she barely registered it because she could see it now clearly. Even through the driving snow, the south hay barn was burning, not smoldering. Burning, with the committed intensity of fire that has been given adequate fuel and is not interested in stopping. She ran. The snow made it strange, the fire ahead, and the cold behind, orange light through white curtains of driven snow, the wind roaring in one ear and the fire roaring in the other. She heard shouting, male voices, alarm, the particular pitch of people responding to crisis. She saw Nico running from the other direction, and Pete and Danny from the bunkhouse, and she understood in the few seconds it took her to reach the barn that this was not an accident. The storm, the timing, Sterling's men, somewhere in the blizzard, using the whiteout as cover. There was no time for that calculation right now. The barn was fully involved on the south and west walls. The doors on the east side were still approachable, barely, and from inside she could hear the panicked screaming of livestock that had been moved there from the smaller outbuildings earlier that afternoon. Nico was already at the east doors, hauling them open against the wind. Pete went in after him. Danny took a horse that burst through the open door, grabbed its halter, held on. Evelyn took the next one that came through, and the next. Her hands were frozen, but they gripped. She didn't see Tomas. She didn't see him until Nico shouted, not words, just a sound that made her head come up. And she saw the south wall buckle inward, a burning beam dropping. Tomas was there, inside, at the rear of the barn where the panicked animals were, trying to cut loose a mule that had tangled its rope. The beam came down across him from the left shoulder to the floor. She was in the barn door before she knew she was moving. The heat was extreme. It was a different thing than she'd experienced before. Not the warmth of a stove, but a pressurized, roaring heat that pushed against her face and dried her eyes immediately. The smoke was everywhere, low and thick. Nico got there first. He reached Tomas from the right side, got under the beam, and lifted with everything he had his injured shoulder, screaming. She could see it in his face, but he didn't stop. And she got her hands under the beam too, and they lifted together. And Tomas pulled himself out, and Nico caught him. They came out of the east doors together, all three of them, into the cold and the driven snow, and the cold had never felt so necessary. She got Tomas down on the ground away from the barn. He was conscious. His left arm hung wrong, and when she put her hands on it carefully, he hissed through his teeth. But he was talking in Spanish, low and rapid, talking to her or to the snow or to God, or possibly all three. She checked him quickly. Left arm, possible fracture above the wrist. Burns on his left hand. Nothing that was going to kill him tonight. Stay here, she told him. Don't stand up. See, he said. And then, because he was Tomas, the mule? The mule's out, Nico said from behind her, and there was something in his voice that was both exhausted and deeply fond. She was about to respond when she heard Nico say her name. Not loud. In fact, he said it very quietly, which was why it cut through everything else. She turned. Jed was coming around the corner of the main barn from the direction of the corrals, and he was wrong. Wrong in the specific, unmistakable way of a person in serious trouble, too slow, too careful with each step, one arm pressed against his side. Even through the blizzard and the firelight and the smoke she could see the dark stain spreading at his left flank, black-looking in the orange light. Too large, too fast. He'd been shot. He made it to within 20 feet of them before his knees started to go. She was there before he hit the ground, getting her shoulder under his right arm, taking his weight, holding him up. Jed, she said, look at me. He looked at her. His face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with cold, the gray-white of serious blood loss, the specific loss of color that came from the inside. His eyes were focused but effortful. Corral, he said. 2 men, they said. Can you walk? I help you? Yes, he said. She wasn't entirely sure he was right about that, but he was, barely, and she got him to the kitchen. The kitchen was warm and bright, and absolutely the wrong place, and the only place available. She got him to the long table. He sat on the edge of it, and then, because he had no more to give, lay back. The dark stain at his flank was coming fast. She cut away the shirt with the kitchen shears without preamble, no time for preservation or propriety. And she looked at what was there, and her brain went into the space it went into, the quiet, cold, focused space her father had recognized in her when she was 19 years old and had stood in his surgery for the first time and not looked away. The bullet had gone in at the left flank. The entry wound was small and dark and bleeding steadily, the steady bleeding that suggested arterial involvement. His rib cage on the left was tender when she pressed it, and his breathing was slightly labored, a fractured rib, minimum, the bullet track running deeper than she wanted. She looked up. Nico was in the doorway, she said. Sealed, he said. Nothing's moving until this blows through. 2 days, maybe 3. 2 days. No doctor reachable, no alternative. She went to her room. She opened the second carpet bag, the heavy one she'd carried herself off every coach and wagon since Boston, the one she'd never set down or let anyone else carry. She lifted out the flat leather case from the very bottom, beneath the books, beneath everything else. She carried it back to the kitchen and set it on the counter beside the stove. She opened it. The instruments lay in their fitted compartments, clean and ordered, scalpels in 3 sizes, forceps, a probe, curved needles, silk thread, a bone saw she hoped she would not need. Her father's set, added to with her own additions over years of careful acquisition. She had kept them clean and oiled and wrapped in cloth through everything, through the debts and the fire and the road and all of it. She had never put them down. Nico saw what was in the case and understood without explanation. He moved to the stove to boil water. This was not a conversation. It was people who understood what needed doing it. Jed's eyes were on her. She took a scarf and held it over the stove's flame to sterilize the blade. The handle wrapped in the cloth she kept for exactly this, watching the metal heat. Her hands were steady. They had to be. She made them be. The fire burned. And then Jed's hand found her wrist. His grip was weak, far weaker than normal, and she registered that with a cold, clinical alarm she did not show on her face, but his fingers closed around her wrist, with what certainty he had left. Don't let me slip into the dark, Evelyn. His voice was barely above a whisper. Pale lips, gray face, eyes that were fighting to stay focused and doing it through sheer determination. She looked at him, at the scar and the gray eyes and the face that had slowly, over months of hard days and quiet evenings, become one of the most familiar things in her world. The scalpel was in her hand. The blade was sterile. The blizzard was locked around the ranch like a fist, and outside the hay barn was burning itself to the ground. And there was no one coming. Just her. Just this. Just the knowledge she'd spent 20 years acquiring in a world that had told her she shouldn't need it. And the hands her father had trained. And the man on the table who had said her name like a prayer. She pressed the steel to his skin. The fire in the kitchen stove was the only steady thing in the world. Everything else moved the blizzard against the windows, the lamp flame, bending in drafts she couldn't locate, her own breath coming faster than she wanted it to. She pressed it down. Her father had told her once, standing in his surgery in Boston, while she watched him work on a man whose arm had been crushed under a cartwheel, that the first thing a surgeon had to govern was herself. Not the patient, not the tools, herself, because everything else followed from that. She pressed the blade to Jed's skin and made the incision clean and deliberate. He didn't make a sound. His jaw was locked, and his eyes were on the ceiling, and his hands, flat against the table on either side of him, pressed down hard against the wood. She registered all of this and moved past it. She had to be in two places at once, present enough to feel what the tissue was telling her through the instrument, detached enough not to let what she felt about the man on the table enter her hands. "Nico," she said without looking up, "hold the lamp closer. Left side." He moved without question. The light improved. The bullet had gone in at an angle, tracking inward and slightly upward toward the lower ribs. She could feel where it had fractured the seventh rib. The bone gave differently under her probe, a subtle wrongness that she'd been taught to recognize. The arterial bleeder she'd identified at the surface was small, a branch vessel, which was good news. She worked to it carefully, the forceps finding it with the confidence of hands that had been trained to find such things in the dark, if necessary. She tied it off with boiled silk thread from her sewing basket. The silk was not ideal. In Boston, her father had used proper surgical silk, prepared correctly, kept in carbolic solution. Out here, she had thread from a sewing basket and boiling water and a bottle of Jed's whiskey and her own knowledge. She had made do with less. The concept of antisepsis, that infection, came not from bad air, but from invisible organisms, that heat and strong spirits could neutralize, was still contested among surgeons who had trained before Lister. Her father had read Lister's work in 1867 and immediately changed everything he did. And he had insisted she read it too. And she had. She poured whiskey into the wound. Jed's entire body went rigid for 2 seconds. A sound came out of him, compressed, involuntary, the sound of serious pain being held down by serious will. Then he went still again. "I know," she said. "It's working." She found the bullet fragment with her probe, one main piece, and a secondary fragment that had sheared off against the rib, which she extracted with the smaller forceps. She held them up in the lamplight briefly to confirm she had everything. 2 pieces, both out. She irrigated again with the boiled water. Nico kept bringing her from the stove, steadily cleaning the wound tract with the thoroughness her father had demonstrated, until thoroughness was simply what she did. Then she packed the wound with clean cloth boiled flour sacking, which was not ideal and was all she had, and began to close. The sutures went in with the curved needle, even and deliberate. She had practiced suturing on the leather of her father's old surgical bag until her stitches were consistent. Consistent mattered. Inconsistent sutures left dead space where infection could collect. She tied the last one and straightened up. Her back ached from bending. She hadn't noticed until now. She pressed her fist against her lower spine briefly and looked at Jed's face. He was still conscious, barely. His color was bad, and his pulse, when she pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, was rapid and thin, the pulse of a body that had lost blood and was working hard to compensate. But it was there. It was regular. It was beating. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. "The bullet's out." Both pieces, his eyes closed. Both pieces. There was a secondary fragment from the rib. I found it. A long breath out. Good, he said. And then, very quietly, as sleep or something close to it began pulling him under, good. She covered him with the blanket Nico had brought from the bedroom. She checked the dressing once more. She washed her hands in the basin and dried them and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at nothing, at the white wall of the blizzard, letting the focused space in her mind slowly return to ordinary. Her hands were shaking now. They shook after. Always her father had told her that was normal, that it was the body releasing what it had been holding during the work. She pressed them flat on the windowsill and let them shake and waited for them to stop. Behind her, Nico said, "Is he going to make it?" She turned around. He was standing near the table, looking at Jed, and his face held the particular careful blankness of someone who needs the truth, but is bracing for it. "If the infection doesn't take hold," she said, "and if I've closed the bleeder completely, which I believe I have, and if his body does what bodies can do when they're given the right conditions." She looked at him steadily. "He's strong, and the bullet is out, and that's the best possible position to be in right now." Nico nodded slowly. "What do you need?" he said. She looked around the kitchen. "Willow bark," she said. "Do you know what it looks like?" "I know. There are willows along the creek bed, south of the near pasture. In the morning, when the wind drops enough, I need the inner bark, not the outer, the inner layer, as much as you can bring." "I'll go first light," he said. "And garlic. There's some in the cellar, braided hanging near the apple butter. Bring it up. And the honey, the large jar, middle shelf." He went for the cellar. She pulled the chair to Jed's side and sat in it. She would not leave this room tonight. This was not a decision she made, so much as a fact she recognized. The next hours were the most critical. The wound was closed, but his body was in shock. And shock had its own lethality that had nothing to do with bullets. She needed to watch his color, his breathing, his pulse. She needed to know the moment anything changed. She folded her hands in her lap and watched him breathe. The blizzard pressed against the house. The stove burned. The lamp held steady. Outside, what remained of the hay barn finished burning itself down to the foundation. Orange light visible, even through the driving snow, going out gradually like a thought you can't hold on to, until there was nothing left but smoke and cold and white. The fever came on the second day, which she had expected. Some fever was the body's own response to injury, the internal heat. That meant the immune response was active and working. She had explained this to Nico when he'd come in that morning with willow bark and a face tight with worry. "A fever isn't always the enemy," she told him, hands working the bark into the water she was boiling on the stove. "It's the body raising the temperature to make conditions hostile to infection. The question is whether it stays at a working level or climbs beyond what the body can sustain." She pressed a strip of bark between her fingers. Her father had used willow bark tea throughout his surgical career, well before the pharmaceutical chemists had extracted and refined the active compound into something they sold in powder form. The bark itself worked. Not as fast, not as precisely, but it worked, and she had it, which was what mattered. She brewed it strong and got it into Jed a spoonful at a time when he was coherent enough to swallow. He drifted in and out. When he was conscious, he was quiet, which was consistent with his character. And when he wasn't conscious, he was restless in ways that told her where the pain was concentrated. She adjusted his position twice, using rolled blankets to support his left side, relieving the pressure on the fractured rib. She applied the garlic and honey to the wound dressing when she changed it that afternoon. This required explaining to Nico, who watched with the focused attention of someone genuinely trying to learn. Garlic has properties that are hostile to certain organisms that cause wound infection, she said, crushing the cloves and working them through the honey. Honey draws moisture away from the wound, which makes it inhospitable for the same organisms. Frontier surgeons used both during the war when proper antiseptic wasn't available. My father documented cases. She spread the mixture carefully on clean cloth. This is not a replacement for proper medicine. It is what we have, and it has historical evidence behind it. Does it work? Nico said. In my father's records, yes. In my own experience, yes. In the cases where it didn't work, other factors were usually involved: contamination at the wound site before treatment, or bullet fragments left behind. She looked at him. I got the fragments. He nodded. He believed her. She appreciated that he had started doing that without visible deliberation, just receiving what she told him and acting on it. The same way she received what Tomas told her about horses and acted on it. Expertise was expertise, regardless of the person carrying it. The fever peaked on the morning of the third day. She knew it was the peak because she'd been charting his temperature by feel, forehead, neck, the skin over his sternum, at regular intervals through all 3 nights, and she could track the trajectory. Up through the first day, higher through the second, and then in the blue pre-dawn of the third day, she pressed her palm to his forehead and felt it. The heat was different, less dense. The skin was damp instead of dry. He was sweating. That meant breaking. She sat back in the chair and released a breath that she had apparently been holding for approximately 72 hours. She changed the dressing again. The wound was red at the edges, but not the violent spreading red of serious infection, more the ordinary red of healing tissue, doing what healing tissue did. She brewed another pot of willow bark tea and sat beside him while the light came up outside. And the blizzard, which had blown itself out sometime in the night, left behind a world that was white and absolute and completely still. The sun came up over the ridge and hit the snow, and the kitchen filled with reflected light, brighter than ordinary morning. Everything washed, clean and quiet. She was still holding his hand. She had not consciously taken it. She must have, at some point in the night, reached across and held it, and he had not let go, and neither had she. And they had simply continued that way through the dark hours without discussion. She became aware of this the same moment Jed opened his eyes. He didn't look at the ceiling first. He looked at her. His color was better, still pale, still the pale of significant recovery ahead, but with blood in it now, the underlying warmth returning. His eyes were focused, present in a way they hadn't been for 3 days. He looked at her face. He looked at their joined hands. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes, which she was aware of, and the state of her hair, which she was less aware of and suspected was considerable. He looked at the chair she was sitting in, which was not designed for sleeping and which she had been sleeping in regardless. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You stayed." "Yes," she said the whole time. "Yes." He looked at the ceiling. Something moved across his face, not pain, not the calibrated control of a man managing himself. Something more open than that, more unguarded. The expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they didn't know they were traveling toward. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't try to sit up," she said. "I wasn't going to. You were considering it." A pause. "Maybe," he said. And she heard it in his voice, faint, still weak, but there. A warmth that was not fever. She refilled the willow bark tea and held the cup, and they stayed in the bright, snow-lit kitchen while the ranch began to wake up around them, boots on the bunkhouse steps, the horses in the main barn making their morning sounds, Nico's voice somewhere outside giving Pete a direction about something. Life continuing the way it did. She watched Jed breathe and thought, I did not lose him. She had lost so much. She had stood in the ruins of her own life and walked away from them with 2 carpetbags and a leather surgical case, and the absolute conviction that she had nothing left to lose and nowhere particular to go. She had been wrong about both. Recovery was slow, and Jed was a difficult patient. Not dramatically difficult. He didn't complain, didn't argue, didn't demand things that couldn't be provided. His difficulty was of a different type entirely, the difficulty of a man who had spent 20 years being entirely self-sufficient and found the condition of needing help quietly, persistently intolerable. On the 4th day after the surgery, she found him sitting upright in bed with both feet on the floor and the clear intention of standing on them. She stood in the doorway of his bedroom, which she had taken over as the recovery room, moving his things to accommodate the practical needs of the situation, and looked at him. "Where are you going?" she said. "I need to see the barn," he said. "The barn will still be burned down tomorrow. I need to see the damage. I can describe it to you." He looked at her. She looked at him. "The hay barn is a total loss," she said. Foundation is intact. The main barn is undamaged. All livestock are accounted for. Nico has calculated the hay stores and believes with careful rationing, you'll make it through winter if it doesn't run more than 8 weeks past normal. She folded her arms. Tomas has a hairline fracture in the left forearm and burns on his left hand that I've dressed and are healing well. He is also supposed to be resting, which he is also not doing, and I will be speaking to him next. A pause. The 2 men who set the fire, Jed said. Gone, she said, into the blizzard, which is its own kind of justice. Nico believes Sterling will deny involvement. Sterling will absolutely deny involvement. Yes. She came into the room and checked the dressing through his shirt without asking permission, because at this stage of their acquaintance, asking permission for medical examination felt like a formality they'd moved past. The wound was clean. The swelling had continued to resolve. Lie back, she said. He lay back. Slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of a man whose body was reminding him with every movement that it had recently been through something serious. But he did it. She straightened up and found him watching her. He watched her a great deal now. She had noticed it during the 3 days of the fever in the conscious intervals. His eyes had tracked her movement around the room with a quality of attention that was different from his usual careful observation. More direct, less guarded, as if the fever had burned away the last of whatever reserve he'd kept, between himself and full acknowledgement of what he saw when he looked at her. She had not addressed it. There was a time for such things, and it was not while a man was recovering from a gunshot wound. She adjusted the blanket across his legs and went to the window. The snow outside had settled into the landscape over the past week, and the ranch looked changed by it, smaller, quieter, the burned foundation of the hay barn visible at the south edge of the property as a dark rectangle in the white. It looked like a wound in the land. They would rebuild it. She knew they would. She had already been thinking about the construction logistics without having consciously decided to. You haven't slept properly yet, said, behind her. I slept in the chair. That's not what I said. She turned from the window. He was looking at her with the directness that had become characteristic of him in recovery. I'm fine, she said. You look like you've been awake for a week. 3 days, she said, and I've been adequately functional throughout. I know you have. Something in his voice shifted. I know what you did, Evelyn. I was in and out, but I know. He looked at his hands, both of them, the scarred and calloused hands resting on the blanket and then back at her. You saved my life. She didn't answer immediately. She had saved lives before Nico's shoulder, the various small emergencies she'd managed in her father's surgery, the 2 cowboys she'd treated for fever and infection since arriving at the ranch. Each time it had been the work, the application of knowledge and training to a problem with a human being on the other side of it. She had never found the right response to gratitude for that. It felt wrong to dismiss it as simply her job, and equally wrong to accept it as if she'd done something that anyone with her training wouldn't have done. You're going to need to do the shoulder exercises I showed you starting next week, she said, or the scar tissue will restrict your movement on the left side. His mouth moved. That's your response. That's the medically relevant response. Evelyn, she looked at him. Thank you, he said. Simple, complete, meaning all of it, not just the surgery. And they both knew it. She nodded once. You're welcome, she said, which was also simple and also meant all of it. The days that followed had a different rhythm than anything that had come before. Jed convalesced slowly, and as he convalesced, the ranch reorganized itself around the new reality. And Evelyn found herself at the center of it in a way that had happened gradually and then was simply true. Nico ran the daily operations, cattle, horses, fences, the ongoing assessment of what the storm had damaged and what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. He did it with a natural authority that the other hands followed without question, which told her something about where that authority had always been, waiting to be formally acknowledged. She found him each morning in the yard before breakfast, already working, and they had developed a habit of a brief exchange, what needed doing, what she'd noticed, what he'd heard from the men. It was not so different, she thought, from the briefings she'd attended in her father's surgery when she was young, when the nurses reported to the doctor on what had changed overnight. She was not anyone's doctor here, but she was the person people came to when something was wrong, which amounted to roughly the same thing. Pete cut his forearm on a fence wire, and she cleaned and closed it with 3 sutures. One of the horses developed a respiratory illness, and she consulted Tomas, who knew more about horse medicine than she did, and whose instincts she had learned to trust completely. Danny came to her with a concern about his back, the kind of chronic, grinding back pain that came from years of physical labor, and she talked him through stretches that she'd read about in a monograph on muscular mechanics, demonstrating them herself in the kitchen, which Briggs walked in on and quietly left without comment. She caught Jed watching through the doorway from his room. "You could do these too," she called to him for the rib. A pause. "I'm watching," he said. "Watching is not the same as doing." Another pause. "I'm taking notes," he said. She turned back to Danny and demonstrated the next stretch, and she heard, from the direction of Jed's room, the smallest sound, the suppressed beginning of a laugh, stopped before it fully formed, because laughing with a healing rib fracture had consequences. She smiled at the kitchen wall, where Danny couldn't see it. Jed was well enough to come to the kitchen table for supper on the 10th day after the surgery. He did it under his own power, moving carefully, and sat at the head of the table in the same chair he always sat in. And the cowboys who had been navigating around his absence for 10 days looked at him and went back to eating with the particular relief of people whose ordinary world has reassembled itself. Tomas, across the table, met Jed's eyes and gave him one small nod. Jed gave him one back. That was, she had come to understand the equivalent between those 2 men of an extended emotional conversation. After supper, when the men had filtered out and she was washing the dishes, Jed stayed at the table. She could hear him behind her, the creak of the chair, the sound of the coffee cup on the table, the particular quality of his presence in a room that she had become sufficiently accustomed to, that she registered its absence when he wasn't there. She dried her hands and came to sit across from him. He looked at her for a moment and then looked at his coffee cup, and she recognized the brief interior gathering that preceded something he'd been deciding whether to say. "Tell me about Boston," he said. "What actually happened?" She was quiet for a moment. She had given him pieces in the weeks and months of conversation over the hearth and the kitchen table. The fire, her daughter. The version she offered generally, which was true but incomplete. The way a map can be accurate about the roads and still leave out the terrain. He was not asking for the map. She folded her hands on the table. "My husband was Robert Mercer," she said. "He came from a good family, or a family that had been good, and was in the process of becoming otherwise. He was charming and well-read, and he loved me, I think, in the way that certain men love things intensely, briefly, and without sustained attention." She breathed. "The gambling started before we married. I didn't know the extent of it. By the time Clara was born, the debts were. The house was mortgaged twice. He had borrowed against everything we owned, and some things we didn't own yet." Jed listened without moving. "He was using laudanum by the end," she said, "which I understand. Medically, the gambling, the substance, they follow each other in a particular pattern in certain people, each one making the other more necessary. I don't say that to absolve him. I say it because understanding why something happens is not the same as forgiving it." She paused. Outside, the night was clear now, the stars extraordinary in the cold air above the snow. "The fire started in his study," she said. "He'd fallen asleep. Clara's room was—" She stopped. Started again. "I was on the wrong floor. By the time I reached her door, the smoke was already." She stopped again. Jed's hand moved across the table and covered hers. Not squeezing, just there, warm and steady, his scarred hand over her hands. She looked at it for a moment. "The debts didn't die with him," she said. "His creditors came within the week. I sold everything that was left and settled what I could, and left with what I could carry." She looked up at him, "which was 2 bags and my father's surgical case and approximately $40. And you came west," he said. "I came west," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His hand was still over hers. "You should know," she said, "that there are people in Boston who believe I was complicit in the financial mismanagement." His creditors found it convenient to expand the story. She looked at him steadily. My name was on none of his contracts. I had no legal access to the accounts. I was told about the debts approximately 6 weeks before the fire. I know you weren't complicit, he said. You couldn't know that. I know you, he said, simply, as if this were obvious and she was being unnecessarily complicated about it. She looked at him across the table at this man, with his old scar and his gray eyes and his quiet, immovable certainty, who had offered her supper on the first day and never, in all the months since, looked at her with anything other than the full measure of what she actually was. A lesser man might feel threatened by a woman who holds a scalpel better than he holds a gun, he said. He was looking at her with a directness that was not casual, that had been arrived at deliberately. But I don't want a quiet shadow for a wife, Evelyn. I want a partner who stands shoulder to shoulder with me against whatever wind blows off those mountains. The kitchen was very still, wife. He had said it plainly, without theater, the way he said everything that mattered straight out, with the expectation that plain language deserved a plain response. She looked at him for a long moment. That's not a question, she said. No, he agreed. It's a statement of what I want. The question comes later, when I'm not recovering from a bullet wound and can do it properly. She looked at the table. She looked at his hand still over hers. All right, she said. All right to the statement, or all right to waiting for the question. Both, she said. He looked at her, and the rare thing moved across his face, not the small, suppressed near smile of ordinary moments, but something fuller, more open. A man's face when he has been given something he had stopped believing he deserved. She squeezed his hand once and stood up and began putting the kitchen to rights for the night, banking the stove, trimming the lamp. He stayed at the table a while longer, drinking his coffee in the warm room. The snow outside reflected the starlight and made the night brighter than it should have been, white and wide and open in every direction, and somewhere in the main barn the horses moved in their stalls, and the broken anchor held itself together against the cold, with the quiet stubbornness of something that intends to stand. She put out the lamp. In the dark, she knew, Jed O'Leary was sitting at his kitchen table, with something on his face she hadn't seen there the day she arrived. Hope looked different on a weathered man, more valuable, somehow, the way anything looks that's been earned the hard way and wasn't expected anymore. She went to her small room and lay down on her cot and looked at the ceiling. Outside the window, a single star burned through a gap in the clouds, and then the clouds closed over it, and it was gone. She closed her eyes. She was asleep before she finished counting what she had to be grateful for. It was a longer list than it had been in Iron Ridge. It grew. She was learning if you let it. If you stayed long enough in one place and did the work and paid attention, it grew. The morning Sterling came. The sky was hard and blue and cloudless. February had turned the valley into something stripped down and honest, no leaves on the trees, no softness in the light, just the clean, cold lines of a landscape that had shed everything unnecessary. Evelyn was at the kitchen window when she saw the horses coming up the road, and she counted them before she identified the man at the front. 7 riders. Sterling in his cream hat. 2 men in the dark coats she recognized from Iron Ridge. And beside Sterling, a man wearing a badge that caught the morning light. She turned from the window. Jed was at the table with his coffee, reading the land survey documents he'd pulled out the night before. He looked up when she came in from the kitchen. He read her face. How many? He said. 7. Sterling and a sheriff. He set down his cup and stood. Slowly, his left side was still careful, still deliberate, but he moved under his own full power now and had for 3 weeks. He went to the bedroom and came back with his gun belt, which he buckled without hurry. She was already at the shelves. The ledger books were on the second shelf from the top, 4 of them, covering 5 years of the Broken Anchor's accounts. She had organized them in October, when she'd taken over the bookkeeping, simply because she had found them in disarray, and disarray bothered her. In the process, she had read every entry. She had cross-referenced every significant transaction against the receipts Jed kept in a tin box in the desk drawer. She had, in the quiet evenings while Jed recovered, gone further writing to her former banker in Boston who owed her father a professional courtesy, asking for verification of certain bank stamps and syndicate signatures she'd found, referenced in the county land office records Nico had quietly obtained during his covert ride to the next county 2 weeks prior. The reply had come last Thursday. She tucked the ledger books under her arm and picked up the letter. Nico was already in the yard when they came out, standing near the fence, with Pete and Danny and Briggs arranged loosely behind him. The casual positioning of men who are prepared without being theatrical about it. Tomas was at the corner of the main barn, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, his left arm fully healed now. He looked like a man watching something mildly interesting happen at a distance. Sterling pulled his horse to a stop in the courtyard. He looked at the assembled ranch and allowed a brief pause, the kind of pause designed to communicate that he was comfortable taking his time, that this situation was entirely at his pace. Then he reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. "O'Leary," he said, "I have a land lien here, registered with the county, showing an outstanding debt against this property that's been called due. Sheriff Poole has a copy." He nodded toward the badged man beside him, who looked at Jed with the careful blankness of a man being paid to stand in a particular place and do a particular thing. "You have 30 days to vacate, or we execute the lien." He let that land. Then he looked at Nico. "I also have a warrant for that man's arrest," he said. "Arson. The hay barn fire has been investigated, and witness testimony places him at the scene." The courtyard was very quiet. Jed said nothing. He looked at Sterling with the steady, unhurried expression of a man who had stood in worse fields than this, and was not going to be rushed. Evelyn walked off the porch. She walked to the center of the courtyard and set the ledger books on the top rail of the fence, where the light was good, and opened the first one. She did not look at Sterling. She looked at the page. The lien references a debt instrument dated March 1878, she said, carrying a bank stamp from the Consolidated Territorial Trust, registered in Boston. She turned to the second ledger. The broken anchor's accounts for that period show no corresponding loan received, no deposit, no interest payments, no acknowledgement of the instrument in any form. She looked up at Sterling now directly, with the unhurried attention of a woman who has already won the argument and is simply presenting the conclusion. "Because the debt doesn't exist." Sterling's pleasant expression held. "Financial records can be incomplete. The bank stamp is fraudulent," she said. That stopped him. She lifted the letter. "The Consolidated Territorial Trust, dissolved in 1876, 2 years before the date on your instrument. I have written confirmation from a senior officer of the successor institution in Boston, who reviewed the stamp upon my request." She held the letter up in the clean winter light. "The stamp on your lien was not issued by any legitimate institution. It was manufactured, which means the lien itself is a fabrication executed with forged instruments, a crime that falls under federal jurisdiction, not county." The two men in dark coats looked at each other. Sheriff Poole looked at Sterling. His expression had shifted, still careful, but now careful in a different direction, recalculating. Sterling's cream hat was very white in the February sun. He looked at Evelyn with something that had dropped the pleasantness entirely. What was underneath was less polished and more honest. "You're a cook," he said. "I'm a great many things," she said. "Today, I'm the woman holding documentation of federal fraud with your name attached to it." She heard it before she saw it, hoofbeats from the eastern road, coming in fast, and then slowing as they reached the ranch entrance. One horse, one rider, who came through the gate and pulled up at the edge of the courtyard. The man wore a federal marshal's badge. Nico, somewhere behind her, exhaled very quietly. She had sent the telegram 4 days ago, the same telegram in which she'd asked Nico to ride to the county seat while the weather was passable, not just for the land records, but for this. She had written it carefully, including the specifics of the fraud, the name of the institution, and the date discrepancy, because a federal marshal would only make a winter ride to a valley ranch in February if the case was specific enough to justify it. She had made it specific. The marshal dismounted. He was a compact man in his 50s, with the weathered patience of someone who had been doing this work long enough to find very little of it surprising. He looked at Sterling. "Harlan Sterling," he said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and the use of forged financial instruments in matters crossing state lines." He reached inside his coat and produced the warrant. "I'll ask you to step down from that horse." Nobody moved for a moment. On the fence rail, the ledger books sat open in the cold light. Sterling looked at Evelyn one last time. It was not the look of a man who had underestimated her. It was worse than that. The look of a man who had correctly estimated her and not respected the estimate, which was its own kind of failure. He dismounted. His men, without their center, lost their arrangement. They looked at each other, and at the marshal, and at the broken anchor cowboys, and made the individual calculations that men make when the odds shift and the cause suddenly has a price tag. They didn't draw. Sheriff Poole put his warrant back inside his coat and looked at Jed with the expression of a man who would be having a professional reassessment in private later. "Morning, O'Leary," he said, and turned his horse around. The marshal rode Sterling back out the gate, with two of his men flanking them, and the courtyard of the broken anchor returned to the sound of horses breathing, and the February wind moving through the fence posts, and somewhere in the barn, a cow making its ordinary complaint about nothing in particular. Nico looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "You could have warned me," he said, "about the marshal, about the plan." "You would have sat up worrying," she said. He considered this. "Probably," he said. She picked up the ledger books from the fence rail and walked back to the porch where Jed was standing. He looked at her, at the books under her arm and the letter in her hand, and the complete composure of a woman who had just dismantled a corrupt land baron with paperwork in the middle of a February morning. He took the ledger books from her. His hand covered hers for a moment in the transfer, and he held it there, and she looked up at him. "Paperwork," he said. "Properly organized paperwork," she said. His hand tightened over hers once before he let go. They went inside for coffee. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in the valley. It announced itself in small things. First, the quality of the light changing before the temperature did, the grass showing green at the roots while the surface was still frost brown, the birds returning to the creek bed willows with their particular purposeful noise. March was tentative. April committed. By the first week of May, the hills above the ranch had gone from gray-brown to something that deserved to be called green, and the sky had changed from winter white to the deep, persuasive blue of a season that meant what it said. Sterling was in federal custody in Austin. The case against him was building with the thoroughness that federal fraud cases built slowly and without drama, and with the kind of institutional permanence that personal intimidation could not touch. His syndicate interests in the valley had been suspended pending investigation. The corrupt water claims had been referred to a federal land adjudicator. The broken anchor was standing. The hay barn had been rebuilt through February and March. Jed designing, Nico organizing, everyone working, and Evelyn providing the organizational structure that kept materials arriving in the right sequence, which she had done by writing 12 letters and receiving 11 useful replies, which she considered a reasonable ratio. The new barn was better than the old one. She had suggested 3 modifications during the planning stage, drawing on what she'd read about ventilation and moisture control in agricultural storage. Jed had looked at her sketches for a long moment, and then incorporated all 3 without comment, which she took as the highest form of agreement. On a Thursday morning in the second week of May, Jed came to the kitchen door while she was transplanting herb seedlings she'd started in the window boxes into the proper kitchen garden. "Come for a ride," he said. She looked at him. He had his good hat on, and both horses were saddled at the post. "Now?" she said. "Now," he said. She washed her hands at the pump and took the horse he held for her, and they rode out of the ranch yard. In the morning light, heading west toward the ridge. She had not been to the high ridge before. She had seen it from the kitchen window every morning since October, a long, elevated line above the valley that changed color with the seasons and caught the last light in the evenings, and was, she had thought many times, one of the genuinely beautiful things about this landscape. Up close, it was something else again. The horses climbed the switchback through scrub oak and cedar and came out on the top into open air, and a view that required a moment of adjustment. The whole valley spread below. The broken anchor was visible house, main barn, the new hay barn with its cleaner lines, the kitchen garden plot, the fences running out in both directions. The creek caught the sun in a long silver line through the valley floor. Further south, Caldwell Crossing was visible as a cluster of dark shapes in the distance, and behind them to the west, the hills went on and on in rolling succession until they became something that might, on a clear day, deserve the word mountains. She looked at it. Jed dismounted. She dismounted. They stood with the horses behind them, and the valley below them, and the May wind moving steadily from the west. He reached into his coat and brought out an envelope. He held it out to her. She took it and opened it. The land deed was thick paper, official, bearing the county seal. She read it through once and then stopped and read one section again. Both their names, equal co-owners. The Broken Anchor Ranch in its entirety. She looked up. He reached into his other coat pocket and brought out a long, flat case covered in dark velvet, the kind of case that came wrapped in careful paper from a city with proper craftsmen and was shipped to places that didn't have them. She recognized the dimensions before she opened it. Inside, fitted into the velvet with custom-cut precision, lay surgical instruments, new ones, gleaming with the particular quality steel of something made by people who did nothing else. Scalpels in 4 sizes, 2 sets of forceps, a curved needle case. Silk thread in 3 gauges, a probe with a handle made of bone, smooth and balanced. From San Francisco she understood, ordered, planned, waited for she held the case in both hands, and looked at what was in it. Jed went down on one knee on the prairie grass. She looked at him. "I didn't hire a cook, Evelyn," he said. His voice was steady, the same voice he used for everything that mattered quiet and certain, and without performance. "I found the woman who saved my life and brought light back to a house that forgot how to hope." He looked up at her, gray eyes, an old scar, and a face that had opened, over these months, into something she recognized now as him, fully him. All of it, the hard parts and the good parts and everything in between. "Will you marry me and run this land as my equal?" The valley lay below them, green and wide in the May sun. She looked at the deed in her hand, at the surgical case, at the man kneeling in the grass. She thought, briefly and clearly, of the torn newspaper advertisement she had kept up pressed between the pages of Gray's Anatomy, all the way from Boston, of the red dust of Iron Ridge and her ruined shoes, and the cold gray eyes of a man who had not wanted to hire her, of every morning at the stove since then, of Nico's shoulder and the barn, dance, lanterns, and the surgery in the kitchen while the blizzard sealed the world closed, of the long nights in the chair beside his bed, and Tomas's face when she handed him his healed arm back, of ledger books held up in February light like a shield, of this valley, below her now, which she had not known existed 6 months ago, and which was, she understood in this moment, with complete clarity, hers. "Yes," she said. He stood. He was smiling fully openly, the rare thing that had been working its way toward completion since the first faint crack of it on the day they met, and she was smiling too. And he took the velvet case from her hands and set it down on the grass beside the deed, and then he took her face in his calloused hands and kissed her. The Texas sky went on without limit above them. The wind moved through the grass. Below in the valley, the broken anchor held its ground in the morning sun, solid and patient, waiting for them to come home. She kissed him back with everything she had. It was, she thought, the correct response to the question. Christmas Eve arrived with snow. Not the blizzard, kind, not the driven, dangerous white of last November. This was the other kind. The kind that fell straight down in large, deliberate flakes and settled on everything with the quiet intention of making the world beautiful for one night. By late afternoon, it had covered the yard and the fence posts and the top rail of the new barn's corral, and it was still coming softly, without urgency. The kitchen was warm. More than warm, it was alive, in a way that kitchens are only alive when they've been worked in for hours, by someone who knows what they're doing and has help they trust. The big stove was running at full capacity, a roasting joint on the lower shelf, two pies cooling on the counter, a pot of something deeply savory working on the back burner that Tomas had contributed to in the early afternoon with the addition of a specific combination of dried chilies that he had refused to specify, and she had not pressed him on because the result was excellent. The kitchen had been expanded in August. The addition ran off the east side of the house, a proper room with its own door and its own small stove for heat, and a set of shelves along the wall, holding the things that distinguished it from a kitchen: clean cloth, instruments in their cases, the reference texts stacked in order of frequency of use, and a narrow examination table that had been built by Pete and Danny to her specification. Above the door, in plain letters that Nico had painted with careful precision, a sign read Dr. Evelyn Vance O'Leary. She had treated 34 patients since August. Homesteaders, cowboys, 3 ranch families from further up the valley who had no other access to medical care. 2 women in difficult childbirths, a child with a broken arm, an elderly man whose wound from a decade-old accident had never properly healed, which she had been able to address with time and the right materials. She charged what they could pay, which was sometimes nothing, and sometimes a cured ham and once remarkable quilt that now lived on the bed she shared with Jed. She kept records of every case in a dedicated ledger that sat on the shelf beside her Gray's Anatomy. It was the most useful she had ever been in her life. Tonight the clinic was closed, and the kitchen was full. Nico was at the far end of the long table, and the chair he occupied was not simply the chair he sat in. It was, as of 3 months ago, the chair of the Broken Anchor's head foreman. Jed had made the appointment formally on a September morning in the yard, with all the hands present, handing Nico the foreman's ledger and saying, in front of everyone, that the Broken Anchor operated on the basis of sweat and honor, and that Nico had more of both than any man he'd known. Nico had taken the ledger with the composure of a man who had known his own worth for years and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. He ran the operation now with an authority that had extended beyond the property lines. 2 neighboring ranches had sent their hands to him for guidance on cattle management, which he had provided, and his reputation in the county had rebuilt itself on a foundation that Sterling's men were no longer present to undermine. He was currently engaged in an argument with Pete about something related to the Christmas pudding, which was not going to be resolved by either of them, since neither knew anything about Christmas pudding, and Tomas was watching them with the expression of a man who finds the foolishness of younger people a reliable source of quiet entertainment. Briggs was eating. He had been eating since he sat down and showed no signs of stopping. Danny had brought his wife, a woman from Caldwell Crossing named Ruth, who had red hair and strong opinions, and who had sat down next to Evelyn an hour ago, and begun a conversation about medicinal herbs that Evelyn had found genuinely stimulating. She was coming back in the new year, Ruth had said, because she knew things about local plants that Evelyn's Boston text didn't cover, and she was interested in a professional exchange. Evelyn had said yes immediately. The fiddle was being played in the corner by a boy of 15 from the neighboring homestead, whose family had been invited, and who played with more enthusiasm than technique, which was exactly right for an evening like this. Evelyn moved between the stove and the table, checking the joint, refilling cups, adjusting the pie plates. She knew this kitchen by heart now, every uneven plank in the floor, the way the oven ran on the left side, the particular sound the flue made when the draw was right. She had learned it the hard way over a year of mornings, and it was hers. She felt Jed before she heard him, his hands coming around her from behind, as she stood at the stove, settling at her waist, his chin at her temple. He smelled of cold air and wood smoke. He had been outside checking the animals one last time, the way he did every night, the last circuit. She let herself lean back into him, just slightly. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was still falling, straight down, large and quiet, covering everything. She turned her wedding ring with her thumb. The gold was warm from her skin. She had been doing this for 6 months, and the habit was entirely comfortable. Nothing like the way she'd turned the first ring with grief and guilt and the constant checking of a wound. This was different. This was the way you touch something you're glad to have. She looked at the room. Nico laughing at something Pete had said. The argument apparently resolved or forgotten. Tomas with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, watching the fire. Danny's wife Ruth leaning across the table to tell Briggs something that made him pause mid-bite and look up. The fiddle boy, finding the melody of something recognizable, and the room shifting toward it. That collective human leaned toward music. She had come west to survive. That was the plain truth of it. She had come with $40 and 2 bags, and the guttered-down remnant of a life and the absolute lowest possible expectation of what the next chapter would contain. She had come searching for shelter, and found this instead: this table, this room, this man's hands at her waist, and the snow coming down outside, and the clinic with her name on the door, and the ledger of 34 patients, and the spring that was going to come again after this winter, and the work that would be waiting in it. She had found Nico's capability and Tomas's quiet, and Briggs's uncomplicated appetites, and Pete and Danny's brotherly chaos, and Ruth, who knew things about local plants, and the fiddle, and the lanterns at the barn, dance, and the ridge above the valley, where the whole world spread out below you, and the sky had no ceiling. She had found a love that did not require her to be smaller than she was. That was the thing she had not known to look for. That was the thing she would not have believed was available to her if she had been told about it. On the day she stepped off the stagecoach in Iron Ridge, with dust on her shoes and blisters on her hands. Jed pressed a kiss to her temple and released her and went to sit at the head of the table, because supper was ready, and the room was full, and there was no reason to wait. She carried the joint to the table. She set it down in the center, where the lamplight hit it, and the room gathered itself inward toward the food and the warmth and the music and each other. She sat at Jed's right hand and picked up her fork and looked down the long table at the people who were, without formal declaration or ceremony, her family. Outside, the snow came down, the stove burned, the broken anchor held. There's a moment early in this story that I keep coming back to. Evelyn steps off that stagecoach in Iron Ridge with blistered hands, a faded morning dress, and 2 bags she carried herself. Jed looks at her and sees someone who doesn't belong. She looks back at him and says 4 words: "I can cook for shelter," and doesn't beg, doesn't explain, doesn't apologize for showing up. She just states what she can offer and lets him decide. That moment is the whole story in miniature, and I think it's worth sitting with for a minute, because it says something true about what survival actually looks like when you're starting from nothing. Evelyn didn't arrive in Texas with advantages. She arrived with knowledge, medical knowledge, that the world had spent decades telling her she had no business possessing. And she kept it quietly, and she kept it ready, and when the moment came that someone's life depended on it, her hands didn't shake until after it was over. That's not luck. That's a person who refused to put down what she knew just because the world told her it wasn't hers to carry. The first lesson this story offers is a simple one. Your expertise belongs to you, not to the room that doubted you, not to the husband who wasted your years, not to the society that told you the limits of what a woman was allowed to learn. What you know is yours, and there will come a day in a kitchen, in a blizzard, with a man bleeding on a table, and no one else coming when everything you quietly held on to is exactly what's needed. Don't put it down before that day arrives. The second thing this story is about is the difference between surviving and living. Evelyn came west to survive. She said so herself, sitting on that wagon bench watching Iron Ridge disappear in the dust. Survival was the whole plan. Find work, find shelter, find some version of a life that had enough structure to keep her moving forward. She was that kind of woman. But somewhere between the burned biscuits and the blizzard and the surgery and the barn dance, survival became something else. It became a life she actually wanted, not one she settled for. One she chose and built and defended with ledger books in the February cold. That shift from enduring to belonging is one of the quietest and most powerful things a person can experience. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small things. Tomas saying, "Good beans, Senora." Briggs cutting himself a second piece of bread. A man with gray eyes asking you to dance like it's a simple thing, when both of you know it isn't simple at all. The third lesson is about what real partnership looks like, and I think this is the one that matters most right now. Jed O'Leary is not a perfect man. He's closed off and slow to trust, and he spent 20 years building walls that were very good at keeping the cold out and everything else out too. But when he looks at Evelyn and says, "I don't want a quiet shadow for a wife. I want a partner who stands shoulder to shoulder with me against whatever wind blows off those mountains," he means it. He means it enough to put both their names on the deed before he puts a ring on her finger. He means it enough to order a velvet surgical case from San Francisco and let that be his proposal. He sees what she is, and he doesn't ask her to be less of it. He asks her to be more of it, with him on shared ground. That's what love looks like when it's working right. Not one person making themselves smaller so the other can feel larger. Two people who are stronger together than they are apart, who defend each other in public and tell each other the truth in private and show up when the blizzard seals the road and there's no one else coming. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. Show up, state what we have, and refuse to put down what we know before the moment that needs it arrives. This has been The Bread and the Bullet. Thank you for being here. This story is a work of historical fiction. All characters, events, and dialogue are entirely fictional and created for storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is coincidental.